All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Friday. Thanks for joining us. Oops. I think that's on that screen. Thank you. All right. So our next session is prioritizing green spaces for people of color in low-income communities in the Chesapeake Bay. Our speakers are Bianca Boggs of Skeo Solutions. Bianca's professional interests include creating sustainable communities through the lens of environmental justice and racial equity, revitalization efforts, and utilizing GIS tools as assets and data analysis. At Skeo, she provides data analysis research and mapping support and creates interactive tools like web applications and story maps. Bianca supports environmental justice projects, reviews, and analyzes policy documents and performs economic research and analysis. She also participates in equitable action planning and conducts data analysis on survey results. John Griffin, another presenter, works to advance large landscape conservation initiatives in the Chesapeake Bay watershed by convening diverse, multidisciplinary stakeholders. The partnership seeks to extend conservation of large landscapes throughout the region to benefit multiple values, including sustainability, scenic, historical, and cultural heritage, working lands, important biodiversity and wildlife habitat, water quality and supply, and overall quality of life. John is the former secretary of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources under two governors, the deputy secretary of the department, the general manager of the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, and served as chief of staff for Governor Martin O'Malley. So without further ado.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you all here. I'm kind of the warm up back for Bianca, which I'm happy to do. I'm also a crickety old man, so I have to hold on to this because I have a terrible lower back. So excuse me for that. Oh, I'm sorry, did I? Well, Bianca was already in this.
Let me see.
While we're working on that, can I give a personal moment of privilege to recognize a few people here in the room. First of all, my Chesapeake Bay Trust runs a conservation corps program. We're very pleased that we had Michael Bunnell. Mike, stand up. Who is our current conservation coordinator. It's a year-long program, and he started in mid-August. He's doing a great job. Secondly, I did see his immediate predecessor, Sarah the Mountain, here, but I'm not. She was here and then she left. But the reason I wanted to mention Sarah as well, she did a great job for us. I'm going to show you a video, and she's the voiceover voice. And I also see Rachel Felber here. Rachel, who's a great communications director, a woman for all seasons and all tasks for the Chesapeake Bay program. Rachel. So this is the agenda for today. I guess we're gonna I'm gonna try to run through these slides pretty quickly because we'd love to have more discussion here with all of you. And I'm sure you're getting hungry. You want to get to the food line. So
We'll introduce ourselves first before this video.
Yeah.
So sorry.
So this is just a brief. The Chesapeake Conservation Partnership was formed 13 years ago in response to former President Obama's executive order on the Bay. And we normally have annual meetings up here, but as all of you know, the last couple of years, because of the pandemic, we've had to do video meetings, virtual meetings. And in 2020, in the height of the pandemic, we did a series of 4 video sessions and then a wrap-up final annual meeting, all focused on public health, green spaces, and equity. Now, I might mention that obviously there's a lot of other environmental factors and other factors impacting low-income and communities of color. But as a conservation organization, we wanted to recognize the need to change past practice of not focusing on these communities to provide green spaces that are accessible to them, either within their communities or proximate to it.
And I'm Bianca. This is just a little Skeo shout out slide. This is a company I work for. And the tool that we'll be presenting today was awarded to us through CCP and the trust program to create this application. So this is just a little slide on what Skeo is all about. Excellence and innovation for people, environmental stewardship, social equity, and economic opportunity. I think one thing that makes us unique is that we have staff across the US. So I'm based in Maryland, and we have my coworker that I work with a lot is in California, for example. So I think that just makes us very well suited to do this kind of work. And then I think we'll show the video of John.
Yeah, so going back to 2 years ago, when we had that series, Chesapeake Conservation Partnership, 4 sessions and then a wrap-up annual meeting. We really reached out to a lot of community organizations, as many as we could get to those various sessions to participate and give us our ideas. So I'd like you to kind of get out of the moment, kick back and relax and think about where we were back in 2019 or 2020. And this is a video that we did for to support a grant from the Chesapeake Bay program that ended up hiring Skeo and Bianca. So.
See if it works. No.
Welcome to the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership's 12th annual meeting. This year, we focused on how to operationalize our new draft public health goal that brings together conservation, equity, and public health. This annual meeting is the culmination of 4 virtual sessions conducted earlier this fall. We have had some amazing conversations with insightful and passionate contributions from participants from all over the watershed and beyond. They represented different organizations, nonprofits, federal, state, and local governments, community organizations with interest in urban areas, rural areas, data and GIS innovations, and the entire watershed. No surprise, there are key themes expressed in all of the sessions. One of the themes familiar to our work is access. Access looks different in urban areas and rural areas. Far too many disadvantaged communities of color have been forgotten by institutional racism, such as redlining or less obvious acts of indifference and neglect. The results have subjected the residents of these communities to multiple sources of pollution, severely impacting their health and quality of life. In addition to this, there are several different limitations which can affect those in these communities and whether they are or are not receiving healthcare. According to the American Hospital Association, there are recognized racial disparities in the incidence and prevalence of certain chronic conditions such as diabetes, asthma, and hypertension. Also, hospitals within the AHA have reported that minority patients require longer stays and more intensive, costly interventions than those required by white patients. The COVID pandemic has laid bare the underlying poor health conditions in these communities by the disparate impacts of the virus. You can see here from NPR that communities of color have had much higher positivity rates and death rates than white communities. Johns Hopkins Medicine has found in a study that Latinx populations have a COVID-19 positivity rate that is 3 times higher than any other racial or ethnic group. The pandemic has also emphasized the public health benefits of spending time outdoors in a variety of green spaces, such as large and vast pocket parks, trails, community gardens, forests, and natural areas. According to a study conducted by the Chesapeake Conservancy's Conservation Innovation Center on metropolitan areas within the United States, park visitations increased within the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area by 93.99% between pre-COVID times and during COVID times. The Baltimore, Maryland area saw an increase in attendance of 86.97%. Many disadvantaged communities do not have parks and other green spaces accessible to them. There is a growing body of studies demonstrating the multifaceted health benefits for people of all ages spending time in outdoor green spaces. A recent literature review of studies demonstrated the multiple benefits of green spaces in urban areas. Yet, there is a major shortage of these green spaces in many disadvantaged communities of color. The land conservation community needs to step up and do their part to improve the public health of disadvantaged communities by working with community-based organizations and local governments to provide various outdoor green spaces that are very accessible, welcoming, and safe.
Finding the balance between what I want and I need. I've been playing with God, but it feels like the devil's been coaching the team. I got so much to say, but anxiety whispers and tells me to speak. I've been living on earth, but one day I was shot to go live in my dreams. I've been lost in my mind for a minute, I'm searching for somewhere to go. I look right at my mom and I cry because I wish she didn't have to get old. I got all of these people around me, but why do I still feel alone? I got all this money, I just bought a house, but with nobody in it, there's no hope.
Darius Johnson from the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy talked about access and growing up in Kent County.
Look in the mirror, I don't see a soul.
The first thing that came to mind about growing up in Kent County is the fact that I am 27 and it took more than 20 years to develop a strong connection with nature and outdoors. Many of my peers who look like me and who grew up like me have the same experience. So even though I grew up with cornfields and woods all around me and a beautiful Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries nearby, I really had very little understanding of how important that was to my own physical health and mental well-being. And as a result of that, I missed out on countless opportunities to fully enjoy the outdoors that makes Kent County great and the Eastern Shore great.
Darius's story and stories like his from others throughout the watershed compel us to address these needs with fresh eyes and renewed commitment. Many disadvantaged communities of color have faced a long and sad history of intentional policies that have created barriers to parks, green space, healthy food, and clean water. These policies were illustrated so vividly by Sadia Mukeef with the Trust for Public Land and her presentation when we discussed how data and analysis can drive equity.
There's a little bit of a trend occurring in terms, not just a little bit, it's quite a stark trend occurring. And Baltimore is a critical example of that, of where health outcomes are really the downstream effect of a lot of challenges and problems upstream. And in order to address that, we have to look at our history. That these patterns are not new, and that they're based in a history of structural racism and injustice.
In order to combat the systemic injustices that have prevailed over generations, land conservation must be community-led and driven. Outsiders must actively work against operating from the white savior complex by engaging communities at each stage of projects as equal partners. This requires little time. We know that an equity focus will require an adaptation of our current scale practices to sometimes target smaller and different conservation measures. For example, placing a greater emphasis on access and also addressing park deserts and not just large-scale landscape benefits. While doing so, we must remain cognizant of what those in the community prioritize. Adapting priorities is crucial to advancing conservation in an equitable way. During each of our lead-up sessions, participants have generated dozens of insights, principles, priorities, and actions for advancing public health, equity, conservation, including access to parks, green spaces, healthy food, and more.
hope that refreshed your memory. There's lots and lots of work to do, conservation community, environmental community, to address historic racism and really move from environmental justice as a slogan to a reality. So that's why we did this project, and that's why we developed a public health green space and equity plan for our partners. And we can look at the next one. So put aside a couple of things on this. First of all, we wanted maybe the first of its kind for the Bay watershed, a map that identified low income and communities of color and their relative accessibility or not to green space. There's a lot of, when you dig into these layers, there's a lot of communities obviously that have no accessible green space. So the other thing I would mention is this is a very user-friendly mapping tool. You don't have to have a GIS degree or have a lot of knowledge about technology or access this and use it. And the last thing I would mention is that other data layers can be added onto this. How many in the room are familiar with the Maryland State Park equity mapping? Right, well, this is a variation of that. One of the people on the advisory committee was John Michael Archer, who led that mapping project for the University of Maryland School of Public Health. But so we adopted some of those ideas here to give people who want to use this, and hopefully people will, opportunity to look at different data sources, prioritize, which is what the park equity mapper did. Next. So those were the key tasks. Not so much time on that. Here are some of the outcomes we hope: increasing green space in underrepresented communities by prioritizing funding, acquisition, restoration of green spaces, uplifting the community, providing more community cohesion. I've been spending a fair amount of time as I can in communities, low income, more communities of color, or both. And some of them have a small park, Best Pocket Park, that they've developed and are using it. A lot of them, when I go out and talk to the residents, say this is really a great way to unite the community. It's a community valued space. And remember, so many of these communities have a lot of folks that can't easily access a park 3 or 4 miles away for a whole variety of reasons. I'm sure you're familiar with. Yeah, this is just the timeline. We got underway in July last year, and we finished with this product earlier this year. Now, I want to mention 2 things here. We had a very diverse, good advisory committee that really guided a lot of this work in terms of what they saw were, what they thought were important things to crank into this mapping tool. And we did listening sessions and communities in the 3 major Bay states, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. So, and I think this is where Bianca takes over.
Alrighty, so like John said, I'll try to get through the slides relatively quickly so we can get into the more fun interactive portion where I'll demo the tool and we can have more of an open discussion. But a couple of background nuggets of where the different data sources and how we created this application. There's 2 main pieces of data: demographics across the watershed, and then green spaces, what we're calling green spaces. And as we'll show in the tool, we're using the term green space as a more broad definition than just parks. And so that's one way that this tool stands out. But yeah, for the demographic data, for those who are familiar with EPA's EJ screening tool, it's an environmental justice screening online application. And their data set is huge, it's robust, and it mainly pulls from the census and the American Community Survey, which is also a census product. It's just more frequent than the 10-year census. So that was the main source for the demographic data, as well as the social vulnerability index from the CDC that will show on a map that's very useful It also looks at things that EJ Screen does, like people of color, low income communities, but also looks at things like access to a vehicle or zero access to a vehicle, crowding in the household. And so that index kind of combines more factors that may typically get forgotten about. And then for the green spaces, as we'll show on the map, it primarily derives from the USGS, the US Geological Survey. And they created this large database of all protected lands across the country. It's called the Protected Areas Database, or PAD US. And it's very extensive. The USGS did all the legwork, thankfully. They reached out to states and localities and other federal agencies to create this database. And the Chesapeake Bay program basically took that data set and cropped it down to the watershed, the extent of the watershed, and supplemented it with other parks or green spaces that we knew existed in the watershed to kind of add on to the USGS database. And so very, very briefly, as John mentioned, this is a web-based tool like EJ Screen, if you're familiar, so you don't need any GIS software or experience, anything like that. Just internet, and you'll be able to access this tool. Just a quick note on how we created it. We used the GIS software Art Pro, and then transferred it to ArcGIS Online, so they can live in a web-based platform. The second bullet is very important, and it might come up later when we demo the tool. Basically, because of the scope of the project, we needed all the data to be available at the watershed-wide level. And as we'll show, the watershed is rather large, you know, it covers many states. And so having data sets that cover that much space kind of limited our potential sources. And so we give the ability in the application to add your own data. If you know if your locality has this really great data set that might not be reflected in the tool. So just keep in mind that this is a watershed-wide view. And then the name of the platform that it lives in, if anyone is curious, is called the Web Application Builder. It's an Esri product, and it's how the app was created. So right before we get into the demo, I just wanted to go over what's in the tool before I open it, and it's a lot to look at. But these are the three main categories of data that are within the tool, and that we kind of touched on already: green spaces, demographics, and then green space accessibility, and what does accessibility mean in this case. So this is the watershed, our lovely watershed. The green space data layer in the tool covers all open and limited access green spaces. And what that means is, according to the USGS and how they compile their information, is it a local park, a state park, a national park that's open 24/7? Is it free to get in? And that is kind of what defines open access to the public, and can they recreate on it as well? Limited access or restricted access kind of gets at maybe a park that's only available a couple months out of the year. Maybe there's a fee associated with it. Maybe you can't do all of the fun and recreational activities on that green space in particular. And so we've grouped those open and limited access green spaces together, and that's how the map kind of defaults when you open it. And you can see on the legend, open and restricted access are two different colors, but you can see the coverage throughout the watershed. As we'll show, the tool is interactive, so you can click on anything, click on a green space if you're curious about it. It'll show you the name of the green space, the access type, who owns it, and all the extra information you would ever need about that green space. And so it's built into the tool in that data set. And then we also have additional land cover information, like tree canopy, impervious surfaces, and structures, water and wetlands. That's really helpful supplemental information to have alongside looking at these green spaces. Any questions on this? This could be a dialogue from this one. So if you have any questions, feel free to stop me or raise your hand. Getting into the demographics that we touched on already. From EJ Screen, the EPA's tool, these are their their demographic indicators. So all of those are individual data layers in the tool that you can toggle on and off and look at how the coverage is throughout the watershed. So people of color, low income, linguistic isolation, which is defined as people in the household over age 14 who struggle with English, or English is not their main language. Those over age 64, those under age 5, and then low life expectancy. And then the CDC Social Vulnerability Index that we talked about is actually what's in this example picture here. So the darker blue areas are the highest vulnerability areas, and then the more yellow areas are lower vulnerability. And I will mention here, it'll come up in the tool. EJ Screen has their information according to census block groups, and block groups are smaller than census tracts, if that helps. Think about it. I think it's a couple hundred to maybe 2,000 people, and they try to group them according to the population and size. So that's why the shapes are, irregular and it's not standardized across the watershed. So getting into green space accessibility and how we're defining what's accessible. Like John mentioned, we had a number of listening sessions with the community. We had our own advisory committee. And of course, we did our own literature review and research. And what we found is that a 10-minute walk is kind of the consensus best practice, or most easily understood sense of what's accessible in terms of accessing a green space, especially when thinking about vehicle access is not available. And so when you first open the tool and you zoom in this case, this picture is zoomed in on the DC area, you'll see the green spaces, and then this lighter green buffer area around all the green spaces will start to appear. And that is that approximate 10-minute walking distance around all of them. In this case, we used half a mile to show that visually and in terms of the distance. And for some GIS reasons, we use half a mile instead of a network analysis. But for all intents and purposes, that's an approximate 10-minute walking distance around all of the green spaces. Also, from the listening sessions that we held, some folks mentioned that maybe a 5-minute walk or a quarter-mile distance around all the green spaces could be a helpful layer to also have in some cases. And then the last bullet there, a 10-minute drive or 5 full miles around all of the green spaces is also another layer in the tool. And we included that one for rural areas and rural green spaces because we wanted to get at a lot of these tools, especially when you think about walkability and green spaces, are biased toward urban areas. Urban areas are more walkable than rural areas. And so the assumption often gets lost that in a rural area, you should be able to walk 10 minutes and get to a green space, and that's not necessarily the case. The understanding there more is that more people have access to a car because they have to drive farther to get to certain things. And so that 10-minute drive is meant to be more for the rural areas. And then we just have the census defined populations for what's urban and what's rural and how we did that calculation. Any questions on that? Yeah.
How did you define a green space? Like, because I've seen sometimes I'll see a golf course is considered green space, but I can't go walk around a golf course without paying, were there limitations there?
Yes, so thank you for that question. Again, that baseline data source is from the USGS, and so their database is called the Protected Areas Database. And so they don't necessarily call it green space, they call it protected areas, but it basically covers a broad definition of what green space is. They do include local parks. Like for example, in my neighborhood, it's like a gated park and you need a key to get in. It's in this database, but the access type is restricted. And so that's how they delineate that. So it's local parks, state parks, national parks, easements, conservation easements are in there. Even some marine areas are also visible. And so you kind of have to dig in their data to see how they're defining it. What they call open access, what they call restricted access. They also have closed access and unknown. And closed access is for privately owned land. So if someone's privately owned green space, no one but them can access it. If you need to know where it is, you'll see it on the map, but it'll be labeled as closed or private. Is that helpful? Yeah.
For urban areas, was it ever suggested that public transportation distance be taken into consideration as a data layer as well?
It was, and it is one. Thank you for bringing that up because I had not planned to talk about it. But yes, we have a distance to the nearest transit stop layer in there, and it's from EPA's smart location database. And EPA also has a walkability index, and so it's that's where it stems from. But yes, that was a factor. Finding a national or even regional database that covers the full extent of the watershed when you're looking at maybe bus stops or metro stops is hard, and it doesn't really exist. And so that distance to the nearest transit stop layer from EPA was what we chose to use to get at that.
The urban versus rural is in what area? 2,500 to 2,000 in a square mile or?
Oh, yeah, so this is just how the census defines it, and so their census defined areas, I'm not an expert on their data, but that's how they measured it, and so it's not in the same context as the census block groups as the EJ screen data, so I can say that's confusing, but, for example, like the DMV, the greater DC area, it'll have the full extent of if that population matches, and it'll draw that boundary around like the DC area and saying in this whole area, the population ranges is between that or greater than 50,000. If it's less, it won't be covered. That's helpful. Mhm.
I have a question about like, it's a two-part question. The first one is the green space, there's green spaces, for instance, in urban areas where they're not being cared for, right? And so earlier you said it's so that somebody could recreate in it. And I'm like thinking about the spaces where like the space has no lighting, it's not being mowed. And so like, yes, maybe someone could walk to it, but they might not be able to actually use it for recreation purposes. And then also the second part of my question, which I'll just tag really on quickly, is like there's pocket parks that we create, right? That are quite small. And so I'm interested in like, what is the smallest green space? Like where's the cutoff on like your boundaries of like green space?
Yeah, thank you for that question. The first part, the way that the USGS kind of defines open access and restricted access, and that kind of gets at the recreation aspect. It's not clearly defined in that category. They have other parts of the data set where they get at, you can swim here, you can hike here. Other parts of the data set, they might not have been able to collect that information and quantify it. And so the open access, restricted access was their way of kind of grouping them in large chunks. And so this doesn't get at, when you click on a green space, for example, it'll say, yes, hiking, yes, you can have a picnic there. It's kind of more of a broad access definition. You can click on it and drill down, you can go to their website and then do further research. So that is a limitation, just how the data was collected, considering it was across the whole country. And then your second question, again, it's kind of hard because it's from the USGS, but the smallest scale of green space I would say is local park. And I use example from my neighborhood. The park is maybe half an acre and it still shows up, and so you have to zoom in really far to find it, but it's there. Again, because this is a watershed-wide database, we would love to be able to bring in data sets from DC. If DC has a really robust park data layer, or Baltimore City, I know has a more robust data layer on like parcel level. Because that wasn't available across the whole watershed, we couldn't include it in the tool as a preset layer. But as we'll show, you can add in data in the tool. So if you know you have a data layer that's at the parcel level, looking at specific lots that you really want to look at, you can throw it in the tool and look at it in context of everything else.
Excuse me, Bianca, I just want to emphasize what we learned 2 years ago and going forward is that a lot of communities need green space within them. As I mentioned, I think a little earlier, for a lot of residents in these communities, a park 3 or 4 miles away is not accessible to a lot of them. So you got to build in ways to do best pocket parks, community gardens, community forests within the communities to serve their green space needs. It's not that a park is not a valuable asset, obviously, but a lot of the residents told us, man, we don't have transportation, we're infirm, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to emphasize that. Thank you.
It's not even transportation. I mean, sometimes you can't get across the street. There's no
Great point.
there's no pedestrian crosswalk, so there's a park there, but you can't get there.
Great point. I mean, these maps need to be ground truth, obviously, you want to zero in on an area to see whether there's barriers that don't show up in this mapping tool that I'm thinking of. I think it's Lincoln Park in Baltimore. I can't remember the name of the roadway, but it's divided and it's there are a lot of underserved communities on the other side of it and around it. But if you have to cross this dual highway, it's impossible. I mean, you risk, getting killed and hit by a car. So that's just one of many illustrations. Good point. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I'll say, while we have this picture up, so this half a mile, it is a proxy. So if there's a highway cutting through, you know, where someone would need to walk from their house to the green space. That is not captured in this map, again, because it's just at such a large scale. But it, like John said, it needs to be ground truth. Then when we worked with the community organizations who attended our listening sessions, they understood that. This is more of a reference tool, a screening tool to understand generally what's happening, and then you need to ground truth the data for sure.
On one of the previous slides, it mentioned that canopy cover was included in the definition of green space.
It's an additional data that we have for like land cover, and so I'll toggle that on when we show the tool. So you can view like alongside the green spaces. And I think that data layer, the impervious surfaces are from the Chesapeake Bay program.
Do you know our cemeteries included?
I'm sorry.
Our cemeteries included in the green space?
I want to say yes. I want to say yes. But like John said, like patches of grass or, you know, just a random field is not captured. It needs to have some type of way for it to be measured quantitatively by the USGS, and that's how they capture the data. And then lastly, and then I'll hop into the tool. A way that you can perform kind of an analysis of green space. Is my community in an area that has green space accessibility? Yes or no? The way to use a tool is when you zoom in and then you see your green spaces, you see the 10-minute walking distance around all the green spaces, then you can turn on those demographic layers that we talked about. And in this picture, we have the CDC Social Vulnerability Index layer turned on. And you can see how these gap areas, these kind of natural gaps start to form. They're not covered by a green space, they're not covered by a 10-minute walk. And they are the kind of these natural gap areas start to form. And you can see the highest vulnerabilities areas are in blue. And so you can see, okay, this area, what's going on right here? Who lives in this area? Why are they vulnerable? They're not covered by a green space or within a 10-minute walk. And that allows you to pinpoint this area over here in PG County. And so that's kind of how the tool is meant to be used. And we'll show another example when I get into the tool. But any of the layers that we mentioned can be turned on to view and reference with the 10-minute walk. So all the demographic and social vulnerability layers, the land cover, the tree canopy that we talked about. We also have a flood hazard areas layer from FEMA. And so you can see how that plays a role as, you know, climate change is a thing. And so how that plays a role with access to green space as well. Any questions before I? So John, I don't know if you want to say a few words, but this is the CCP website and the web page where this tool lives. So there's just this little paragraph intro to what the tool is and why it was created. And then we have this link to the user guide, which is actually really helpful. And it's just a 3-page document that has a link to the tool. And then we also have a link to a brief instructional video where you'll hear my voice going over a lot of demos. But this is also an available resource for users. And then when you scroll down the page, you'll see the app embedded on the web page. And then we have the ability to open it in a new tab so you can see the full tool. So I'll do that. And this is what you see when we first open the tool. A little welcome message with the CCP logo. Okay. And again, this is all you would need to access the tool. Just how I opened it, you can on your laptops or your computer. On the left-hand side, we have just this introductory text to explain what the tool is and why it was created again. And then you can see across the top where it says how to use this tool. And it gives a really short step-by-step, I believe 11 steps, how to use the tool and all the little buttons and widgets and things going on as another reference point. In the middle, we have our map, obviously, and you can zoom in and out, and we'll show the interactivity of this. And then along the right side, we have those 3 groups of data that we talked about: green spaces, demographics, and accessibility. And so under green spaces, you can see these little check boxes are how you can toggle things to be visible on the map. So we have our open and limited access green spaces that are visible by default when you first open the tool. The closed or unknown access green spaces that we talked about are also available for reference. And then these land cover layers, such as tree canopy, the water, wetlands, impervious surfaces, and flood hazard layers that we talked about. Under demographics, we have some reference layers, counties, congressional districts as well. And then from there, we have all of the layers from EJ screen, and the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. And then under accessibility, we have our walking and driving distances that we mentioned. We have two additional layers that, excuse me, help look at the green spaces in a different light. We have total green space acres per capita, which is extremely important when you think about green space coverage in reference to how many people it serves. On the map, you can see maybe, oh, this community has a park, they're good, you know, they're within a 10-minute walking distance. But if that park is 1 acre and it's supposed to serve 200,000 people, is that equitable? Is that park really serving the needs of all the people that live there? And so that's what that layer is getting at. Total areas of acres of green space within each census block group. The distance to the nearest transit stop, like we talked about, and then the walkability index from EPA. So I will zoom into Richmond for an example. So when we zoom in, our green spaces will load, and then we'll see that 10-minute walking distance start to appear around all of our green spaces. When you zoom in even further, you can start to see these blue lines appear, and those are all the census block groups that we mentioned. And so that's how the shapes are drawn at this scale. I will mention that each of the census block groups have all this data summarized for you. And so if you're curious and you don't want to go through all the demographic layers and toggle everything on and off and spend too much time in here, you can say, okay, this block group doesn't have any green space in it. I can see that. You can click on it and see all of the summary information compiled for you right there. What the total population is, if it's primarily in an urban or rural area, if there, how many numbers of green spaces and acres are within that block group, and you can see that's 0. The approximate people of color percentage and percentile nationally, the same for low income, linguistic isolation. And then we have the social vulnerability score, which is from 0 to 1. Then the walkability score, which is from 0 to 20 from the EPA as well. And so if you're looking for, you know, a quick and easy reference point for your community, you can just come in and zoom straight into the tool. These layers will turn on automatically and you have that summary data. If you want to, however, kind of do that green space analysis that we were talking about. And let's say we want to look at demographic index. And I'll explain what that is in a moment. You can see how that flows in. So demographic index from EPA is both people of color and low income at the same time. So it's 50% the value of the people of color, 50% the value of low income, and they combine them to create kind of this one score. So you can look at them both at the same time. And in our legend, in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see how the colors play out. And so the yellow, orange, and red areas are where those values are very high for the people that live there. And so you can see how, make this a little darker. You can see how these natural gap areas start to form in the southwest part of Richmond. And here you can see these areas, these red, orange, yellow areas are not covered by a green space or within a 10-minute walking distance. And you can see the percentiles that they fall into under the demographic index. And if you want to explore more, okay, so they have high rates of people of color and low income. What about their low life expectancy? Is that kind of following a similar pattern? And you can see the darker burgundy-ish areas are also kind of following suit. Are they vulnerable according to the CDC? Yes. So you can kind of toggle through these layers and see the patterns that start to form in those areas that are not covered by green spaces or within that 10-minute walk. I'll also turn on our tree canopy layer while we're here, so you can see how that loads. This is a very, very, very fine-grained land cover data set. And so you can, each dot on the map is, you know, a tree canopy. And so you can get really fine-grained scale. So what's going on in this gap area here? You can see there's a lot of tree coverage here, but for some reason it's not covered by a green space. What's going on there? And it allows you to ask those questions and kind of dive deeper. I will also mention we have this base map feature. And so if you want to look at an aerial imagery, which is always helpful for me, you can do that. So you can see exactly the buildings, the houses, how these neighborhoods line up in reference to the green spaces in the tree canopy. And so you have a lot of flexibility. This tool can be really customized to meet the need of whatever user is using this. Are there any questions right there before I show the other bells and whistles? Yes.
When it comes to your different layers and the metrics that you use for them, how often are you guys planning on updating them?
Great question. We have suggested yearly. A lot of this data won't change. Such as. Yeah, the land cover data, I believe, the Bay program actually just released the new land cover data set.
Right.
But for EJ Screen, like I said, it's mainly pulling from census and the American Community Survey data. And so as often as those are being updated and as often as EJ Screen is being updated, we suggested at least checking for that yearly to make sure that those data sets are up to date.
And that's manual update, that's not like automated.
It is, unfortunately, yeah.
So for the fancy data, what source is it from, or where did you get it from?
It's from the Chesapeake Bay program. I believe they used, I didn't work on the data set, so I can't speak to it, but I can very easily point you in the direction, but I believe they used, just aerial imagery and LiDAR information.
Thank you.
And now, is that the 2017, 18 data, or is that the whatever one with 15, 16?
This is the previous one, only because we created this tool prior to them releasing it, but yes, as easily as we included these layers in the tool, they can be swapped out, and, I'll actually pull up these three dots right here where it says description. It'll link to, for each of these layers, link to their source. So if you're curious about where it's pulling from, it'll send you straight to, the data set that it's pulling from.
Has this work been done for other watersheds as well?
I don't know if you want to answer that, John. Yeah, I'm not sure. I will say the USGS's PAD data set, the protected areas data set that was used for this. I've seen it used in many resources. The Trust for Public Lands also has a tool. I think it's called their Parkland Mapper. It's really useful. It looks really similar to this in the way that they look at a 10-minute walking distance around parks, but it is just parks, and rather than this kind of larger green space definition. And for theirs, they use, it's called a network analysis, but it basically takes into account what we were talking about earlier, like physical barriers, highways. Is this, yes, it's in a 10-minute walking distance, but can you actually walk there? And so their tool gets at that, which is a national tool.
Are you aware of other maps that are tracking the degree of maintenance and level of investment in the park?
That's a good question. I'm not aware. If anyone is, please share. But I'm not.
I don't think so. I mean, that'd be a great data set to gather and update every what, couple of years. Because that's a great point. That's why ground truthing is so important.
Yeah, I mean, just the racism that underpins all of this.
Yeah, sure.
Also underpins the degree to which these green spaces are actually useful.
Yes, and safe. Right.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's also really dependent on spatial data. Like, do you have that in spatial data as the other component to it? Because like, yes, that's important to track, but like, and can we even put it on a map?
Really community by community, you know, like this is a tool for a local community member to use. Like, if you do a manual for our neighborhood or something like that, they're really trying to get investment into it.
Yeah.
And I'll pull up just a couple other functions I did that you're talking about. For Richmond, this add data button right here is really powerful and allows us to, like a couple of other web applications, to be used for literally anything. If you wanted to add a data layer for something completely random, you have the power to do it. So you'll click this button, and you can type in any keyword, search for any keyword. In this case, I'm going to search for urban island. And you can see this, I know this layer is from the Trust for Public Lands and serve for urban heat island severity for US cities. So we can add that. I'll turn these other layers off so you can see. You can see how their data layer looks overlapping with these green spaces. And so when you take into account, you can add in any localities data. If you know your city has very specific streetlight data, and if you want to understand if it's well lit, you can add it. But the question is it available across the whole watershed? And for the whole tool, no, but you have the power to add in as many data layers as needed, really. And you can also, I'll point out, you can also print these maps. You can also obviously take a screenshot, but this little print button right here allows you to print kind of a higher definition PDF and image files of the maps, kind of the custom maps that you create within this tool. And I will also mention, are there any questions before I keep going? I will also mention that you can export this data. As again, we wanted this to be kind of a tool for local community organizations, not only screen, but be able to extract data to use for their purposes. You can see this filter down at the bottom right hand corner. And so, for example, under census block groups, if you want to search for, show me the census block groups that have no green spaces, that have, there are people of color and low income populations above the 80th percentile. And then only export those, only show me those on the map, and I only want to see those. I'll turn everything off so you can see that. Number of green spaces, 0. People of color population percent is greater than 80. And low income population is greater than 80. We turn this filter on with this little button right here. And when we zoom out, only those census block groups that meet that criteria are showing now. And I'll turn off the green spaces. You can see how those blue lines kind of faint, but just how all the other census block groups were filled in. Now we're only seeing those that meet that criteria. And when you click export under our census block groups, I can open this in a table, and this is explained in the user guide, so I know it's a lot of steps, but we have the option to click under options. There we go. Export to CSV, which is a spreadsheet file. And so if you want to filter for a very specific criteria, you can do so and export that into a spreadsheet and say, okay, in my county, these census block groups meet this criteria, we can target these areas. You can have that data pulled straight from this tool. Okay. Any other questions? One of the other slides we have is if there's anywhere else in the watershed that anyone else like me to zoom into and play around with the tool.
Yes, sir.
Did you work with any local government partners to ask them like, what would their needs be in terms of identifying their priorities?
Yes, during our listening sessions, so we held 3. I believe we had pretty good coverage in terms of community organizations from Baltimore, from DC, some from Virginia as well, and Pennsylvania, who mentioned things like the 5-minute walking access. They really push for that because they want kind of a range of different scenarios that could be played out within this tool. And so that's why we kind of have this large range of different data layers, and that kind of came out of those conversations. People wanted to explore different scenarios and things like that. The ability to export data and filter, like I just did, was also a big thing that they talked about. How can we use this tool to help us write grants? How can we pull pictures and data from here to help us with what we need to do? If we don't have a GIS person on staff, someone to manipulate these data layers, how can we use it? And so that's why we made everything very transparent. You can, like I said, go to the source for all of these layers right in the tool. Export the maps, export the data, as well as these contextual layers that I'm hovering over, the counties and the congressional districts. We didn't even consider adding those until we met with the community organizations, and they said things like this are very helpful for them in terms of reference data. So
I might add to that, when we were circulating earlier versions of this, a number of local governments identified parks that were missed in the PAD US that we added. I can't say that was universally the case, but we did get a lot of good feedback, and if they were in there, we added them.
absolutely. I think it was Arlington, Virginia, and those one in a little bit. They noted like the PAD US, for whatever reason, USGS did not capture in their most recent update some of these parks or green spaces in Arlington. Arlington has just been very active, I guess, in adding parks recently. And so we noted that when then found the more recent update of USGS, which just came out coincidentally, and then added those in. So now they're visible in Arlington right here.
Another question. Are you guys you're using PADIS, not the protected land layer from the Bay program, right? Because that, I know that they have a little bit different in terms of their definitions, and they take some stuff out that PADIS keeps in.
So, yes, the version from the Bay program, the version that they're currently working on is doing more tweaks to PAC US. The version that we use in this tool is more, I would say, true to the USGS data, how they define open and restricted access and closed access. But yes, going forward, it is going to be the Bay version of the data set. It's still derived from USGS, but yeah, like you said, with more nuance to be Chesapeake Bay specific in the future when they do more updates. Any other, while we're in the tool places on?
You mentioned Lincoln Park before. I would love for you to put that in there. I work with a friend of Lincoln Park. And, you know, there's so many dead ash trees in the park. There's no funding to take care of the park. So even if it comes up as same thing where people can't get to the park safely, I'm just curious what it comes up as sort of. LEAKIN.
Might not show
LEAKIN.
Oh,
No, LEAKIN.
here.
Is that like Aaron Murray interest on?
Yeah.
Yep.
So you can see they define it as open access. I know I forgot to do this, but yes, you can click on anything and the little pop-up box will show you. The owner, state the access, acreage and ownership type. So. There is a park and kind of the range of coverage. It is labeled as open access according to their definition. Let's put this in there. So with a 10-minute walk, or again, approximately half a mile around that part. But of course, like John said, it would need to be ground truth. What are the streets? Are they walkable? Are there sidewalks? Things of that nature.
Like the restrooms are working or not, like
Yeah.
the bathrooms are closed. You want to go there, you can go for an hour.
Just wondering, kind of a ending question here, is the partnership doing any sort of campaign outreach just to promote the tool through outreach communications efforts or through partners or anything like that? Or, I mean, this is a good.
We're starting to spread the word. Rachel Belver, whom I mentioned earlier, is gonna do, we're gonna do a blog and then develop a webinar. And we're trying to pass it out through, you know, the Conservation Partnership is a network of networks, so we're getting it out there. Asking them to share it with their networks and urge people to use it. So that's a great question. And that's, I think, going to be a continuing effort for a while. You know,
I just wanted to say, folks, we have reached our town. If you are scooting off anywhere else, if you can fill out those survey forms, I'll be at the back of the room handing out tickets. But that would be much.
thank you all very much.
Thank you.